Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining on this Friday. Might even be Saturday for some of you where you are. It is Friday here in New York City where I am. Thanks so much for chiming in on this YouTube session. It's a collaboration between GMAT Club and Admissionado. My name is Doris Wong. I am a senior consultant specializing in MBA applications at Admissionado, and I'm excited to be back on this series. So thank you again all for chiming in. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with all of you because I have some slides that I prepared. So bear with me one moment while I do that. Okay. Great, looks like that's working. So we'll pull this up. And again, while we're waiting for some more folks to jump in, let me just give you a brief introduction. Admissionado is a US-based admissions consultancy, but we do have clients all over the world, including many in Asia and South Asia. So we're familiar with working with clients and their needs from those countries. We do both college consulting and MBA consulting. Today's session is going to be focused on MBAs. That's probably why you all tuned in. And again, my name is Doris, and I've been working with Admissionado for a number of seasons, helping MBA clients specifically. Today, what we prepared for you is a session on selecting and preparing the best recommenders. Now, I imagine it's mid-November. Many of you who are listening to this session are probably deep in the middle of your round 2 applications. Some of you may have done round 1 already. You're doing more apps in round 2. Others might be diving into MBA applications for the first time. So it's a lot to take on between the essays and the resume and recommendations and the GMAT and all of this. And the recommendations can cause a fair amount of anxiety. We're aware of this. And we're here to help you out with that because there's a lot of, I think, misconceptions about recommendations. We call them letters of recommendation, or LORs for short. So you're going to hear me referring to LORs constantly through the session. We know they can be stressful because you don't control them. Right? These are outside voices, often more senior people that don't report to you, who are weighing in on your candidacy. And again, you don't have full control over what they're going to write, how they're going to write it, when they're going to write it. So that can create a lot of anxiety for many applicants. So we're here to help you out. We're going to go ahead. Today's session is going to be an overview of the entire LOR process. And I think this will broadly apply to most cases. We will have a Q&A session at the end of this presentation, so do feel free to, if you see a situation that you're facing that's not addressed in the content, feel free to hold on to that question for the end, and you'll have a chance to ask it. But the state of mind that I think many may be in right now is, what do I do about my LORs, right? Help me out here. I've listed a few very frequently asked questions that we get all the time from our applicants and from GMAT Club users. And so these are the types of questions we're going to address today. Number one, I'm worried about anyone in my workplace finding out that I'm applying to B school, especially my manager or supervisor. This one is far more common than you might think. So if this is you, if this describes the situation you're in, there's no need to panic. There's a number of ways around this. And ADCOMs, or admissions committees, I'm going to call them ADCOMs for short, they're also highly aware that this is it's a pretty commonplace issue that a lot of applicants face. So don't worry about this. We'll come back to it. I haven't worked for my current employer for very long, and I don't know if my current boss can write a very detailed LOR for me. Also, not that unusual. Many MBA applicants are still pretty early in their career tenures, and so maybe they've been, they've worked for a couple different companies and they've moved around recently. They may not have a very long track record at the company where they are currently. So again, this is something that's, there's a number of solutions for this that we're going to talk about. So again, nothing to be too stressed out about. Another question we get, how important is it to have an LOR from an alumnus at the school I'm applying to? So if you're applying to, Duke Fuqua, if you're applying to Wharton, the question we often get is, do I need to have somebody who went to that business school write my LOR for me? Again, we'll come back. I'm just listing all the frequent questions right now. We will come back to the answers for all of these. I just want to see, give you guys some context for what we're going to cover today. Can I submit extra LORs? So most schools typically ask for 2 LORs from different recommenders. We often get asked, can I submit a 3rd one or a 4th one or a 5th one? We'll talk about that. And many more questions that arise about LORs. So that kind of sets the stage. Before we dive into specifics, I want to spend just a few minutes going over the nuts and bolts of LOR, so you understand at a high level what these are about and the role they play in your application. LORs should do two things. Number one, they should validate your story that you're telling in the other parts of your application, like your resume and your essays. And number two, they should provide extra insight into your potential as a future business leader. It's very important to understand both of these components. If your LORs are doing only number one or only number two, but not both, they're not really maximizing the potential that they could have to really boost your application in the applicant pool. With regards to validating your story, it's very important that what your recommenders are saying about you lines up with what you've said about yourself, right? If we have any sort of major inconsistencies about your job title, the function and responsibilities that you had at the workplace, stories that you're telling in your essays, if they don't line up with what your boss or your recommender is saying about you, we have a problem on our hands. So that confirmation is extremely important. But a lot of applicants forget about number two. The point of a really, really great LOR is that it's a third-party voice, right? It should provide a different, fresh, new perspective that, again, is consistent with what you're saying about yourself, but then goes above and beyond and gives the AdCom more information about you than what you can provide in your own components of the application. So we'll come back to this, but this is an extremely important point. At their very best, LORs add these third-party voices that I referenced that should seal the deal for you with the AdCom. What I mean by that is, most of the time, an LOR is not going to make or break an application, right? So you might have an applicant who's teetering on the border. Maybe a terrific LOR comes in and says to the AdCom, all right, we're convinced we're going to take this applicant into our incoming class. It's a little bit more rare that you have an LOR that is so negative or so detrimental that it can break your application. At worst, what we've seen is sometimes an LOR is very tepid, it's very generic, is not particularly enthusiastic, and so it doesn't necessarily harm the applicant, but it can miss out on the opportunity to really give that applicant an advantage, if you see what I mean here. So the other thing to note here is with an LOR, it's a way for the AdCom to judge your ability to really understand who your advocates are, right? So it's showing your judgment also. If you pick somebody who doesn't have much to say about you or much nice to say about you, that reflects in your judgment. So picking those recommenders is extremely important. And again, we'll talk about that during this session. What do your recommenders actually have to do? Because nowadays, the way it works is usually there's an online application portal. Many of you've probably seen this for each school. You have your own login, so you can fill in your information in the application, but your recommenders get their own logins as well. So you are not submitting this information on their behalf. Typically, they have their own user credentials, their own passwords, so they can go into the portal themselves. They see a different set of pages than you do, and so you won't have access to that. So let's talk briefly about what they're going to see. What is it that you're actually asking your recommenders to do for you? They will have to fill out some basic biographical info, things like name, obviously, perhaps their address, their phone number, just contact information. It's obviously all kept for internal purposes. And they'll have to talk a little bit about their current job, what their job title is, how long have they been at that company, just to give the AdCom some context. Second, there's typically a ranking matrix. So this is a very simple grid. It looks kind of like a spreadsheet. And down the left-hand side, these schools will list a number of different qualities that they're looking for in their applicants. So this could be communication skills, could be analytical skills, could be teamwork. And then they ask the recommender to rank you, usually compared to, for example, it might say this applicant is in the top 1%, top 10%, top 50% of all the employees of that level that I've encountered in my career as the recommender, right? So I am being asked to rank you on a number of different qualities relative to other people of your age, of your experience, of your tenure that I've worked with in the past. So that's, again, it's just checking boxes. It's fairly straightforward, but it is the AdCom's attempt to somewhat quantify or put parameters around some of these qualities that they're measuring in all their applicants. And then third and finally, we have the free responses. This is typically what we think of when we talk about a recommendation letter. It is not usually an actual letter. Instead, it's usually a number, 3 or 4 different short answer questions that the recommender has to respond to. And one thing to note is, in the vast majority of cases across these top MBA programs, the questions are very similar, if not identical. So the good news is, once your recommender has prepared their responses for you for one school, for the most part, they're going to be able to copy and paste for other schools, as long as they are careful to omit the names of actual specific schools. Make sure that they don't, write to Harvard saying how great you will be for the Stanford program. That's obviously not good. All right. Again, just a quick reminder, if you do have questions, we will save those for a Q&A period at the end. So just for sake of continuity, I'm going to continue with the content. But if you do have a question, just jot it down. And at the end, I'll open it up for Q&A. Okay? All right. So now that we understand the basics of what an LOR consists of, let's talk about what makes for a terrific LOR. So the best ones that we've ever seen, what do they look like? What do they contain? Number one, this is the most important thing, is lots of detail. An LOR is most powerful when it's specific about you, right? When whatever the recommender is saying about you can only apply to you because the recommender is telling stories and using examples from your career and your life. LORs that are not effective are very generic, high level. They might say nice things about the applicant, but they're all platitudes, right? This person is a people person, right? Or this analyst is excellent with spreadsheets. That could be said about a lot of these candidates, especially for top MBA programs. So when we talk about detail, we're specifically looking for stories, examples that the recommender can speak to, can attest to, and they might be the same examples that you wrote about in your essays, or they might be different stories that corroborate the same themes, but usually storytelling is what we're looking for here. It's not necessary to have quantifiable metrics here. So there might be an example of a story that simply doesn't have a sales figure or a revenue figure or a profit margin attached to it. So you don't have to get hung up on making sure there's numbers in these stories, but the story should be told in high detail and specific to you. That's very important. And there's a way in which you can help your recommenders come up with these stories. We'll talk about that a little bit later in the presentation. Related to this, a recommender has to know you well and has to speak to your business abilities. It does not help anybody if you get a recommendation from the CEO of a Fortune 100 company who's never met you before, who doesn't know who you are and hasn't actually worked with you closely. Adcoms are far more interested in hearing from your immediate boss or supervisor or partners who worked with you day in and day out, or perhaps very intensively on a project or on a client for a period of time. That's much more useful for the AdCom than having, somebody super senior who might be a high-level executive, but they don't have anything specific to say about you because they don't know you well. The other thing is a good LOR has to talk about your business abilities. Remember that you're applying to business school. Okay, this is not applying to college. It's not applying to generic grad school. It's applying to business school. So what AdComs are looking for here is evidence that you have what it takes to become a terrific business leader. Okay, so a question we frequently get is it okay if one or more of my LORs comes from extracurriculars, right, or from university, from college days? There are cases in which that can be effective, especially as an extra LOR, as a third LOR, if it's permitted by a school, or perhaps as your second LOR. But again, keep in mind, if, for example, if you do a lot of community service, if you have somebody in that charity or in that nonprofit organization who can speak to the fact that on a weekly basis, you organize 10 teams of volunteers to go out into, low-income neighborhoods in the city, okay, that to me is a business ability that they can speak to. That is compelling versus if the letter of recommendation simply is talking about how you've devoted, the last 8 years of your life to tutoring kids, and you've become a real mentor figure to all of them. That's wonderful, but again, that doesn't talk about your business abilities, right? So this is all, again, it comes down to your judgment. You should be able to evaluate whether this recommender is going to be able to speak to your strengths as an MBA candidate. That's extremely important. Over the years, we at Admissionado, we've read hundreds and thousands of letters of recommendation for our clients, and we've come up with something that we've called the 70-30 rule. Again, this is probably one of the most important nuggets that I hope you take away from this session. What we mean by the 70-30 rule is a really stellar LOR should be 70% focused on that validation that I spoke about earlier, right? It should be confirming the facts, the stories, the qualities, the characteristics that you've already presented in yourself in the rest of your application. So it should be consistent, right? Perhaps the recommender is really just telling the same story from their point of view, or maybe they're adding on some new angles that you might not have known about because you're living your life, you're experiencing a story from your perspective. Maybe they saw things slightly differently, and maybe they can tell a whole new angle to the story that you aren't able to. But that's the 70% that should be the bulk of a good LOR. The other 30% is these nuggets of gold, we call them, that only a third person, not you, only somebody else would know about you. So for example, this could be, if you're in consulting, for example, and, once a year, all the partners of the firm get together in a closed room and they evaluate the analysts, the associates, the project leaders at each level, and they have a confidential discussion. You're not in that room, obviously, when you're being evaluated, but maybe your recommender was in that room, and maybe he or she has some insights from that closed room discussion that they can share in the LOR, right? Or perhaps your one of your recommenders is a partner who's been at the firm for 15 or 20 years. They've worked with hordes and hordes of analysts and associates, and they can say, this person, Sally or Bob, is in the top 5% of consultants that I've ever worked with on this aspect or that aspect. That's something that you're not going to know about yourself. But your recommender, if he or she is a truly outstanding recommender, they're going to be able to write that about you. So that should really constitute, roughly, these are rough numbers, but that should really constitute about 30% of a terrific LOR. If you just have that for 70%, it's good, but it's probably not going to move the needle for you. So that 30% is extremely important for you to communicate to recommender. Make sure that they understand that they're there to provide additional information and insight that you may not have knowledge of yourself. I went through these already, just some more supporting information. Again, what I mean by qualitative assessments here also is there are some things that can't be quantified. So for instance, we've seen a recommender say about a candidate, there's something, I can't put my finger on it, but there's something that happens when Johnny walks into a room and when he states his opinion, makes his argument in favor of a particular business case, everybody in the room stops and listens. I don't know what it is. It's a magical quality that can't be taught, but Johnny has it. That's an example of a qualitative assessment that's still very powerful coming from somebody who has been in business a long time. Again, not something that Johnny himself would have known about himself necessarily, right? Because he doesn't see it the way his recommender sees it. But that can be a very powerful example that we see in some LORs. Finally, a really great LOR has to be honest and it has to be authentic. And this, again, is everything's tied together. It ties back to choosing people who know you very well, who are your champions and want to see you succeed. But AdComs read so many thousands of these every single year that the ones that are disingenuous or perhaps don't have as much enthusiasm, but honest enthusiasm behind them, they can see it very clearly. So you want to make sure, again, you're picking somebody who's going to go to bat for you and is really excited to help you out. All right, let's talk about a sort of sticky topic. It can be sticky. For some people, it's very straightforward. For others, it's not. And that's getting the LOR from your boss. Why is that so important? So I should emphasize that this is the default. AdComs expect that one of your recommendations will come from your current boss. You might have more than one, that's fine, but meaning you might have more than one boss, in which case you perhaps pick one or the other, or you get 2 letters from both of them. But they expect to see your current supervisor listed as one of your 2 recommenders. It matters because typically your boss is the person who knows you best, who can speak not only to your past performance in your current role, but who also has the ability to gauge your potential as a business leader going forward, as a middle manager and then someday as a senior executive. Presumably your boss is in the best position to do that. Now, again, as I mentioned before at the beginning of this presentation, it's a much more common circumstance than you might think to have a situation where an applicant doesn't want to make it known to his boss or her boss, or even to their employer that they're applying to business school. That could be prejudicial, perhaps, to their chances for advancement or for promotion if they stay at the company or the firm. So what happens if you really, really, really can't get an LOR from your current boss? Are you doomed? No, the answer is no, of course you're not doomed. Again, it's actually a pretty commonplace situation. In that case, there's a couple things you need to do. Number one, we do highly recommend you use the optional essay, which almost all schools have. They say, is there anything else you want to tell us about your application? We recommend that you do use that space to very briefly explain why you can't get an LOR from your current boss, right? And it shouldn't be a whole dog and pony show. It can be very simple, 1 or 2 sentences, and you can simply say, look, at my firm, it's highly competitive. If my boss were to find out that I was planning to leave the firm for business school in a year, that would really hurt my chances to advance. Fine, that's all you need to say. Or, whatever the reason is, put it in the optional essay and make sure that you make it known to the AdCom. And that, again, it's not extraordinary, it's not rare, so you don't need to make a big deal out of it, but you should address it in the optional essay. In that case, who can you get a recommendation from? Hopefully you might have a former boss. So this could either be at the same company if you have many different divisions and they're pretty separate from each other. Maybe you have a former boss or supervisor from a different team or different division of the company. Or perhaps if you've worked for multiple companies, maybe you can go back to one of your bosses at your old company that you've already left anyway and ask for a recommendation from him or her. Alternatively, you can look for a supervisor of some other form or somebody who can speak to your business abilities. We already talked about how important that is, and your leadership potential, as well as someone who has the ability to compare you to others that they've worked with before of your same level or similar level. So perhaps you work in an organization, maybe you work at a startup company or a family-owned business, or you're in some sort of situation where you don't have a formal boss that you report to. That's fine. Well, put on your thinking cap and ask yourself, well, who else plays somewhat of a supervisory or mentor role to me? Who has the sort of seniority to be able to compare me to other people that I might be working with currently, or compare me to, analysts or associates or junior managers from the past, who are older than me now? Who has the ability to, who has the perspective to do that? That person is probably the best alternative if you can't get your boss to write you a letter. Again, here I will mention it briefly. We talked about the pros and cons of having somebody who's not, who hasn't worked with you in the workplace write a letter. Again, if it's a nonprofit or somewhere where you've spent some time volunteering, if that person supervises you in some capacity, that could be a very good alternative. Now, one note here is we get some questions from some applicants about getting professors to write them recommendation letters from back in college, or some people have gone to grad school already, might have a master's degree. The problem with a professor is, can they speak to your business abilities, right, or your leadership potential? They might be able to talk about what a great researcher you are, how academically talented you are, but those are not necessarily qualities that an MBA AdCom is looking for. So again, professor, I'm not saying it's a bad idea, especially as a third recommendation, again, if it's permitted by the school that you're applying to. But typically, we don't encourage a professor to step into one of the two main recommender roles, just because, again, they're not necessarily going to speak about your business abilities, unless there's somebody who was for example, a faculty mentor or faculty advisor to perhaps the clubs that you belong to in college, where you organized a really large conference, or you put on some really big event that really highlighted your leadership and teamwork abilities. In that case, then perhaps that professor would be a good fit. But again, can they speak to your business abilities? That's the most important thing. All right. So that really covers at a high level what makes for a terrific LOR, what all the different components of the LOR are. Let's talk tactics at this point. What is your job as the applicant with regards to the LORs? Because even though the LOR is being written by somebody else, you still have a lot of work to do to make sure that the LOR is the best that it can be. So let's talk about your role. First and foremost, start early. If you're applying in round 2 now, in the next week or 2 is a great time, if you haven't already, to speak to your recommenders. You also want to make sure they say yes, right? You want to give yourself a little bit of cushion in case somebody is too busy, or for whatever reason they believe they're not the right person to write your recommendation letter. You want to find that out now. You don't want to find that out a month from now, right? So start early, get going on this process if you haven't already. The other responsibility you have is to make this process as easy on your recommenders as possible. It's a fair amount of work. It's a lot of paperwork. You get a lot to fill out. If you're applying to multiple schools, 4, 5, 6 schools, they might have to repeat this process multiple times. Again, the good news is much of it can be copied and pasted. So it's not as if they're doing 5 or 6 letters from scratch. But it's a lot of work, and you should recognize that you're asking a pretty big favor from your recommenders. So make it easy for them. What do I mean by that? Ideally, after you've asked them and they've said, yes, I'm willing to write an LOR for you, ideally, you're going to have a sit down with them. Face-to-face may be difficult this year given COVID, so perhaps it's a video conference, Zoom, or Google Meet, or perhaps it's just a phone call. Worst comes to worst, if you can't get a hold of them, of course, a very detailed email will serve the purpose as well. But ideally, you have some face-to-face or at least voice-to-voice time to give your recommenders an overview of why you're doing this. Why are you applying to business school, right? So spend some time with them, explain to them your school list, which schools are you applying to, just so they have that context. Why are you going to business school? A lot of the questions that the AdCom is going to ask you, right? Why now? What are your short-term and long-term goals? That's important context for them to have. You want to make sure that's consistent. What they write about, if they say that you want to, go work for a family investment office, but then in your essays you talk about wanting to go into venture capital, that's not good, right? You want to make sure you're on the same page. So spend that time up front with your recommenders, orienting them in the world that you're living in, which is all your MBA applications. Bring them into that world a little bit. Let them see what you're thinking. The other thing is you should plan to send them a packet of attachments. If you have any drafts of your essays, for example, the goals essay especially, or if there's an essay that talks about your past performance where you have to have work stories, send a draft to your recommenders. Just say, hey, this is just FYI. I want you to see what I'm writing about so that you can keep that in the back of your mind. Send them your resume if they haven't seen it recently. If there's any other, it's typically resume and essays. Those are what we recommend you send, again, just so they have the information. And then the key thing is, we always recommend that you send, it can just be a list of bullet points. If there's some other, format that you prefer, that's fine, but a written document that captures the top stories that you think that recommender should use in their letter for you, right? So these could be projects that you've worked on with that recommender. They could be achievements, accomplishments that you've made in the workplace under that supervisor's, guidance. Spell it all out. If there are numbers that you can put in there, profit, revenue, number of teams involved, whatever it is, put that down on a piece of paper. It should be like a cheat sheet for that recommender to use. Now, of course, he or she will have his or her own perspective to layer on top of that, but make it really easy for them by giving them all the information they need, all the building blocks to create a really terrific LOR for you. It's your job to stay on top of deadlines. It's not their job. Ultimately, they have to be the one to submit all the information and hit send in the application portal. You can't do that for them, but it is your job to keep track of the calendar and make sure that don't pester them, but at strategic points in time, perhaps it's 4 weeks out, and then 2 weeks out, and then 1 week out. Hopefully your recommenders are people that you see or speak to fairly frequently anyway, and you can kind of stay with them during the process. But just make sure that you're sending reminders, friendly reminders, when the time comes, to make sure they're getting plenty of heads up, because again, these are busy people. They have many different priorities they're juggling, so you need to make sure you're top of mind for them. This is this next bullet point, it's not super important. It sort of depends on your relationship with your recommender. We do encourage you to request to see a draft of your LOR from a recommender if they're comfortable with it. If they prefer to keep you out of the process, that you should go with that preference. Respect that and honor that. But if they're okay with it, you can say, look, I just want to, if you don't mind sharing a draft with me, I'd love to give you some feedback. Maybe it'll trigger some ideas for additional content that you can add in there. Really frame it as not you're checking up on them, right? But like a nanny, but rather, look, I want to help you. I want, if there's additional info that I can give you, or if there's a slight direction that I want to steer my application in, you have the time and the ability to do that. We do recommend that you don't see the final version, however, because you will see in the application portal on your end, there will be a box that you're going to check to say that I did or did not waive my right to see the final LOR. That box is not going to make or break an application, but generally from a sort of transparency and integrity point of view, it's best if you can check the box. And obviously you don't want to lie about that. If you have seen the final version, then you shouldn't check the box saying that you waived the right to see your final LOR. But ideally, if you saw a draft but you didn't see the final version, then you can honestly say, I didn't see the final version, I waived my right to see it. And it sort of gives the AdCom that extra confidence that the LOR process was honestly done. And but again, this sort of is a good middle compromise where you can see an earlier version of the letter. You can weigh in on it if you need to, but you can still honestly say, hand over heart, I didn't see the final version. I'm going to check that box on my application. And it goes without saying, of course, but say thank you, whether in your culture, perhaps writing a thank you note, or, just sending a small little gift, a token of appreciation after the fact, not before. You don't want to make it look like it's bribery of any sort, of course, but whatever it feels appropriate to you in that relationship and in your culture, to say thank you to your recommenders for really going to bat for you. Do make sure you do it once the whole process is said and done. Okay, the last major piece of content before we go into questions is some don'ts that I want to make sure we discuss clearly. These are these can be sticky questions. They can be different cultures, different countries might look at these in different ways, but especially, I think many of you who are on this session are probably planning to apply to US programs, maybe some European programs, but Western programs generally. And so you have to keep in mind sort of Western culture and what it is that these adcoms are, the sort of standards of ethical conduct that they're going to be holding you to so that you can act accordingly. The most important one that I really want to spend some time on is do not write your own LOR for your recommender to sign. Again, we at Admissionado worked with clients in all around the world, and we know that in a number of East Asian and South Asian countries that are very hierarchical in culture, especially corporate culture, recommenders expect you to write the LOR. They say, okay, well, you know yourself best. You know what you want to say. You write it, give it to my secretary, give it to me, and I'll just sign it. Done. That's not okay certainly for US programs, and again, for Western European programs, that is considered a form of dishonesty. And again, adcoms are aware of the cultural differences and complexities around this, but the expectation is the recommender is the one writing an LOR. And there's really no excuses around this. Now, there are a lot of different ways to approach this problem. If you have a recommender who is just refusing point blank to write the letter for whatever reason, you have to ask yourself if that's the right person to write you a recommendation, right? So if you're really meeting with a lot of resistance on this, and you've explained to him or her that from from the AdCom's perspective, this is considered dishonest, it's an ethical issue. If they're still not budging, you want to just pause and ask yourself, is this the right person to be writing an LOR for me, okay? If the answer really is yes, because there's other compelling reasons why you need this person in your corner, there's a number of different strategies you can follow. So one is to actually sit down with that recommender, book some time in their calendar, get on the phone with them, have a cup of tea, and ask them verbally to go through their answers to the questions. So again, most of these questions are posted online, so you can see them somewhere, but ask them verbally to go through it. Maybe you can ask if you can record the conversation so that you have a record that you can then transcribe later. If they don't want to do that, you can just take notes, bring your laptop and write it down and just say, look, I'm just going to take notes, and then I can send you an outline, and then you can turn to a letter, or I can even draft the letter based on verbally, the conversation we're having, and then I'll send it to you, and then you can, of course, make any edits. So it's a lot, you're doing a lot of the heavy lifting for them. You're setting them a draft already, as opposed to having them have to start from scratch, which can feel like an enormous obstacle for some recommenders. So that's often a good way to go. Another way is to have an intermediary. So for example, if your boss has a secretary or personal assistant, and that person can help you, perhaps, they can take dictation, or they can actually draft the letter and then work on it with your recommender. That way you're not even technically part of the process. That's also another way to go about this. But generally, you find many recommenders, when the applicant explains that for US AdComs or Western European AdComs, it's not okay to have an applicant write the letter, most of the time they understand. And again, if it's somebody who really wants to see you succeed and do well, they'll understand that, and they'll find a way to work with you. Do not ask a peer or a subordinate to write you an LOR. So again, in some cultures, in certain countries, this might be considered more okay than in others. For the programs that we're mostly talking about here, US programs, European programs, it simply doesn't help your application at all, right? The whole idea is to have somebody that you're reporting to or who is senior to you evaluating your potential, right? Because they're presumably in a better position to do that because they're farther along in their career and they've seen more of the, the business world. Somebody who reports to you or who is a peer, who's of the same level of you as you, doesn't have that perspective, most likely. So don't bother. And even as a third LOR, fourth LOR, these are really not helpful. And again, it sort of speaks to your judgment if you submit these. So just steer clear. Extra LORs. We talked about this a few times during this session. Some schools will explicitly tell you that they do not want extra LORs. So please read the instructions. If they do have this rule or this policy, it will almost always be listed in on the admissions website. Make sure you read that thing back to front. Maybe it's in the FAQ section or the section talks about LOR specifically. So do take note of that. If a school asks you not to send it, don't irritate them by sending another LOR. Okay, it's just going to create more bureaucratic red tape, and they're not going to be happy about it. If the school is agnostic, doesn't say anything about extra LORs, or says you're permitted to, then fine. It typically doesn't hurt if you want to submit a third, or usually it's a third LOR. You don't really want to go into fourth and beyond. That's just excessive. It's overkill. But if it's something that's permitted by the school, or they don't have a spoken policy about it, you can certainly do it if you think it adds some new dimension to your application. So look at your application holistically and say, does this third recommender really have a new perspective that does not appear anywhere else in my application, in the entire application? If the answer to that is yes, then great. This could also be a place where an LOR from an alumnus of that school could be helpful. Generally, it's far more important to most adcoms that they see, again, a recommendation from somebody who knows you very well. They care a lot more about that than, oh, this person also has an MBA from our institution. Really, it's like a marginal factor that really is not important. However, if you know somebody who is a very senior alum of, let's say, Harvard Business School, Wharton, whatever, and when I say very senior, I mean somebody who's like in the news media, right? Who's talked about amongst industry circles, like someone who'd be pretty recognizable to the public, and they're an alumnus of that school, great. Maybe that person's one of your two main recommenders, or maybe that person's not your direct boss, and so you have them write an extra LOR if it's allowed. That can be helpful, or if it's somebody who's very, very active in their alumni community for that same school. So if you're applying to, Chicago Booth, and you know somebody who actually is, on the board of trustees of Chicago Booth, or they've led fundraising for their class for the last 15 or 20 years, that could be a compelling voice because it's somebody who's very actively engaged in the school community. So that matters to the AdCom. But if it's somebody who graduated 3 years ago from business school, from that same school, or somebody who's, perhaps somewhat senior in your firm, but isn't somebody who's really a leading, figure in your industry, then it doesn't really move the needle for you. Again, probably won't harm you, but for this alumnus question, usually has to be somebody who's either like a super public figure who went to that school, or somebody who's very actively involved in fundraising and in the alumni community. Maybe they're the head of the, Harvard Club of New York, and you know them, and okay, great, that's for somebody who's going to be able to speak to the school and how you're going to contribute to the school in a way that they want to see as an invested alumnus. Finally, we encourage you to avoid using different recommenders for different schools in general. Some students create a whole spreadsheet and they say, okay, well, I know 5 or 6 different people, each of whom has an MBA from a different school. So I'm going to maximize, sort of slot them in so they're writing recommendations for that school only. And it's this whole rotating game of, musical chairs. The reason we encourage you to avoid doing this is it just becomes very complicated to manage. You're going to be busy enough as it is with the rest of your application. It can be very confusing, and it just sort of creates extra trouble that's not really worth it, as I've already mentioned with the alumnus question. Again, some exceptions, if there's somebody who is a very involved alumnus or they're very, very famous, okay, of course, yeah, you want to use them for that particular school. But in general, the best people to speak for you for all of your applications will be those recommenders who know you very well, ideally your boss or former bosses, and that's going to be true across the board. So just don't create extra work for yourself because it's going to be challenging enough as it is. So this is really not worth it. Okay, so that brings us to the end of the prepared content. I'm going to switch. I'm actually going to stop sharing my screen. So right now we're on Q&A, and I'm going to welcome you to type in any questions you might have into the chat box. And GMAT Club's going to help me sort of keep track of any questions that you might have, and I will answer them for you now. So feel free to chime in. Okay, I have a question from Amani. Should we share essay recommenders? Yes, I did mention that earlier on, that when you sit down to prepare your recommenders for this process, I do recommend at that point, if you have a draft to share, and it could be just a rough draft, may not be in its final version yet, depending on the timing of all of this. But yeah, it's a good idea because that way, your recommender, like you said, is on the same page as you. They know what you're saying, and so they can make sure that what they're saying as well dovetails with that. And it might even give them some ideas or some specific examples they can draw from in their LOR as well. So I think that's a great idea. You don't have to keep them updated on every single draft that you do. Just at the beginning, equip them with that information as part of that introductory packet that you're going to give them. From Rebecca. Is it necessary that the recommender has to be really excellent or hold a high position in the company? And no, it definitely is the short answer. And again, we've addressed this in a few different ways during the presentation. It's far more important that that recommender knows you very, very well, works with you ideally on a daily basis. If not, then really closely in a project management type of situation or another supervisory relationship. That is much more important than what their job title is or how high they are in the company. There's not going to be any way for the AdCom to know if your supervisor is a high performer at his or her level. That simply doesn't matter. And so you don't want to get too caught up in thinking, okay, well, this person's reputation or credibility in the company is going to really matter. Chances are it's not. And again, the inverse is true too, where there are applicants who get very enamored with the idea of having executive vice president, a C-suite member of their company write a recommendation for them. That can be terrific if that person knows you very well, if you work directly with them, ideally for a sustained period of time, and they can really speak with specific details to your leadership capabilities, your technical capabilities, right? All of these things. If they can't do that, it really doesn't matter that their title says CEO or CFO or whatever. In fact, it's going to be an empty LOR in that case because it won't be specific to you. So it's much more important. I'm just going to emphasize this again. It's far more important that that recommender knows you well, wants you to succeed and is going to be a champion for you. That's much more important than if, what their job title is or how high up they are in the company. From John Eric, how does this information change for deferred applications? Would professors be more appropriate in this case for college students? Generally, I would say that the LOR strategy doesn't change for deferrals. That might be an instance, again, it depends on the school. Make sure you check their policies. If you've been deferred or waitlisted, perhaps it's an opportunity for you to send an extra LOR at that stage of the game that you think is going to move the needle. But if you're, for example, if you're a reapplicant, like if you were waitlisted last year and not accepted, or that happens to you this year, and then you're thinking about reapplying in the following, 2021, 2022 cycle down the road, the LOR strategy that we've been discussing during this session is still the same. It really doesn't change. Professors for college students. So if you are applying, for example, to the 2+2 program that some universities like Harvard have, yes, of course, in that case, it's expected that probably one of your LORs is going to come from a professor because you've been in college, you don't have years of work experience. Again, ideally, it's a professor who can speak to your ability to not just be a student academically, but to be a leader in an organizational sense, right? So again, ideally, that's a faculty member who has advised you, perhaps in a student organization, perhaps there's some sort of club that you've been a part of that faculty advisor has close knowledge of. That would be the most powerful kind of professor recommendation. If it's just a professor who taught you, in some courses, maybe supervised some independent research, again, remember, you are applying to business school. So those qualities of being a great researcher, being top of the class, how much does that translate into, you're going to be a future leader of your industry? It's difficult to see the connection there. So you really want to keep that in mind. If you are going to have, I'm not saying that you can never have a professor write a recommendation, but ideally there should be some angle to this that is the professor's ability to speak to your business capabilities, not just your capabilities as a student. Okay, from Vivek, if I only get one LOR, will it work? Again, if I get one generic LOR from my recommender, can I just send the same to every college, or do we need to fill individual forms for every college? Let me address the second part of that question first, which is the logistics of this. Every single school will have their own portal that you need to submit this information through. So the actual content can be largely the same. And you do have to make sure that the questions, remember those free response questions I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, you want to make sure those are the same. Again, they're 85% the same across schools in the sort of top, elite MBA programs. They're very, very similar. But you actually need the recommender to log in and look at their portal so they can tell you. Again, sometimes the admissions websites will have this information posted so you as the applicant can see it in advance. Other times it's not posted and you need the recommender to log in and actually see the questions that are being asked. So you just make sure that you're answering the questions that are being asked. But generally across the board, once you have that base LOR, your recommender can take most of the same portions and just copy and paste it as needed into the different school portals. If you only get one LOR, it depends on the school. Some schools might, say one is fine. Others are going to require two. You just have to follow the specific instructions for that program. We really recommend trying to get at least two different voices to be prepared to speak for you on your behalf. Only having one means you're really putting all your eggs in one basket. And again, that might actually be a real problem for some schools. If they do require two, then you got to find a second recommender anyway. But even if a school says, you can submit just one reference letter, which sometimes is the case, we recommend having a second person just because it's going to be a different perspective. It's yet another voice to add to your application, hopefully as an advocate for you. Okay, so AJ is asking, would it put me at a disadvantage if both of my recommenders are working in the same company and have supervised me in a similar capacity? No, AJ, that's not a disadvantage. Hopefully, they're still different people. They're different individuals. So hopefully they have seen different aspects of your performance. Maybe they have different views on what your potential could look like once you get an MBA and you move on farther in your career. It's still two different voices, right? So I would say it certainly is not a disadvantage. I think it's all the more important in that case that you do sit down with both of them. Perhaps you in your mind already have some sort of vision or idea for how their voices could be complementary rather than overlapping, right? So, maybe it could be as simple as one person's been there for 10 years, one person's been there for 20 years. So they have a different perspective on the company and on you. Or, maybe each of them has different strengths. Maybe one person is more of a marketer and the other person's more of a finance person. So therefore they can focus on and write about different aspects of you. As a business person, whatever it is, I would give it some advanced thought. And then when you sit down to brief your recommenders, suggest those themes and say, look, I'm asking so-and-so, my other supervisor, to write the other letter. So I just want to make sure maybe you guys get on the same page with each other. Or again, as I mentioned before, you can ask to see a draft, and then you can just make sure at that draft stage, the letters are, again, complementary rather than being too redundant to each other. And at that point, it's not too late to intervene and just say, look, so-and-so wrote the same story. Maybe you can tell it from a different perspective, or maybe you can tell a different story altogether. So you might just be, I would say you can be a little bit more engaged and involved in the management of those two recommenders, but it certainly does not put you at a disadvantage because at the end of the day, it's still two different people who are weighing in on you. Okay, from Yashi. What if my recommenders do not have perfect English and their LOR might contain some grammatical errors? Is it fine if the AdCom understands the message they're trying to convey? Great question. I'm glad that you brought that up. Actually, because we didn't really talk about that. Yes, that's something else that AdComs understand perfectly well. And these schools that we're talking about, of course, have very global student bodies. They are well accustomed to getting applications from people from lots of different countries where English may not be the primary language of business at all. So there's a couple things you can do here. It is totally fine if an LOR does not have polished perfect English. If anything, that makes it feel more authentic. It feels real. You can tell that the recommender really did write it. So that's absolutely fine as long as the message, as you say, is clear enough and they are, they're using specific enough examples that the story is easy to grasp for the AdCom. That's perfectly fine. You do have an option, and this is something I would check with your recommender to see if they're comfortable with it. You could use a translating service. So it could be something as simple as there's a lot of software in the cloud now or just on the internet that can translate from some other language into English. That is a possibility. If you do that, I would probably just put a note maybe in your optional essay to say, my recommender's native language is Arabic or is, Swahili. And, we use translating service for his or her LOR. Just make it known in case anything comes out kind of funny in the translation, the AdCom will understand why. Or you could always, of course, pay a translator. That's an extra cost. I would say it's not necessary unless your recommender really has no grasp of English at all, in which case it might be worth your while to just pay somebody who's a professional translator to actually do translation. You can also pay, you don't have to pay. It could be the case that perhaps there's someone else in the company. It could be a secretary. It could be, perhaps another manager, one of your peers who can translate it. If you can translate it yourself, that is acceptable. Again, I would note that in your optional essay, just say, look, my recommender is not comfortable with English. He or she wrote the original LOR in Mandarin and I translated it into English. Just better to be transparent. It is okay for you to do it, but again, if possible, we recommend that you kind of take an extra step back and distance yourself a little bit from the LOR process. So if it could be a secretary or an assistant or somebody who is more comfortable with English, or a professional translator, that's also a good way to go. Okay, from Aniket, will a recommendation from my target B school alumnus stand out? My supervisors graduated from one of my target B schools. Great. I mean, that's certainly doesn't hurt. I think that at the end of the day, right, most of these programs are, been around for a long time. They've produced many, many generations of alumni. So it's not necessarily something that is very unique. Again, it can't hurt you if one of your supervisors went to one of your target schools. That's terrific. Like, all the better if they can speak to their experience and knowledge of that school and why they think you will be such a good fit for that school. They obviously have credibility speaking about that if they're an alum. But I guess the message I want to leave you with is you don't have to go out of your way to dig up or unearth somebody who went to one of your target schools to be a recommender, right? It's much more important, again, that they know you very, very well. They've worked closely with you. If they happen to be an alumnus, great. Make sure that that person is at least writing an LOR for that school. Maybe they're doing all of your schools, but that's great. If they are, it certainly doesn't hurt you. Is it going to make you really, really, really stand out from the crowd? Like I said, if that alumnus is super involved and ideally a fairly senior alum, you're not somebody who graduated 5 or even 10 years ago, but someone who graduated 20, 25 years ago, they've been around for a long time, they've contributed to the school community, they've maybe financially donated to the school, that matters, and make sure the recommender writes about that in that case, in his or her LOR, or if they're really like a leading light in the industry, somebody who's, constantly quoted figure in the media in your industry, then of course that can be a boost up. But for the most part, again, it can't hurt you for sure. It can only help you, but it's not necessarily going to be super, super unique. Is unfortunately just the reality of it. Okay, John Eric, should there be any overlap between LORs, such as both LORs discuss the same initiative or extracurricular? I think that's what EC, I think that's what that stands for, of the applicant. Let me come back to the 70-30 rule that I spoke about, the Admissionado 70-30 rule, which is that in the strongest LORs that we've seen, 70% of the LORs validate or confirm or corroborate what you've already written about elsewhere in your application. It could be your resume, it could be your essays. And the other 30% should be new, fresh, original content, right, that you couldn't possibly know about, but only a recommender would know about you. So in that 70%, yeah, it won't be surprising if there's some overlap between what recommender 1 writes and what recommender 2 writes. That's to be expected. I would advise you, if you're managing your recommenders closely, briefing them, prepping them, maybe seeing a draft along the way, look out for anything that's too redundant, right? Because it's just a lost opportunity to have some other piece of information being added in, right? So if your 2 recommenders are writing pretty much about the exact same stories and with the exact same assessments of you, it's not a bad thing, but again, you're missing out on opportunity to have a new, fresh perspective in your application, right? So I think it's fine if they write about the same story, the same project, the same extracurricular, but ideally they're bringing a different set of insights to the table because they're different people, right? So maybe something stood out in one person's mind about a project that you worked on that the other person, didn't really pay attention to because they're just different people or they're in charge of different aspects of that work. So that's the kind of thing you want to highlight. So totally fine if the topic is the same, but ideally you want to tease out the individual nuances of what recommender 1 can tell about you and about that story versus what recommender 2 can tell. Okay, I think we have time for a couple more questions. From Itipat, is it okay for recommender if recommender has supervised me at a company, but he is currently self-employed? Yep, totally fine. Pardon me, just have another drink of water. Yeah, as this is related to another question that another viewer had asked before. The AdCom's not going to get very hung up on, what that job title is of your recommender. If they've left the company where you worked with them, that's fine. They'll just have to, they'll write about that in the biographical section at the beginning of their portal. So they'll just explain, it's been 2 years since I worked with this candidate, but we worked together for 5 years before that, right? So that's all background information the AdCom is going to ask for anyway. And again, it really doesn't matter if that person is now starting their own company, if they're stay-at-home dad or mom, doesn't matter. As long as they can speak convincingly and specifically about the work that you did when you guys were together, that's the part that counts. From Gib, I was laid off at the beginning of this year, and now I'm self-employed. Would it be possible to ask for my supervisors from 2 previous companies? Yeah, I think Gib, I'm sorry to hear about the layoff, but a lot of people are experiencing bumps in the road like that with their careers in 2020. So not the end of the world by any means. Yes, in that case, if you do not currently have a supervisor, I would say the most obvious thing to do would be to look at your previous supervisors from previous companies. Again, they will explain in the biographical section of their their portal when they log in, how they knew you, when they knew you, all that good stuff. So you don't have to explain any of that. They will be asked to. And yeah, as long as, again, they can, if it was quite some time ago that you worked with them, you might just want to make sure in that briefing document, that packet that I told you about that you should give to your recommenders, make sure that you spend extra time refreshing their memory, about what you guys worked on together. If there were key metrics that you can point to and you can go ahead and put in that document, that'll help remind them of your time working together and just make it that much easier for them to write a great letter for you. Okay, thank you, everybody. Looks like we've come to the end of our session. I hope that was helpful to you. If you have any questions as you go through round 2, you're welcome to reach out to us, www.admissionado.com. We'd love to hear from you and help you in this journey. And again, best of luck to all of you, and stay safe also for the rest of 2020. Take care. Thanks, guys.